So let's take a look at the major points changes for every single army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's massive points changes that they've made to every single faction in the game. The 10th edition points are finally out, and we can actually start piecing some of the armies together. As mentioned, there have been some absolutely seismic shifts to the way that you build armies in Warhammer 40k. I talked about the main cut and thrust of that in the last video. The two really big changes is that all war gear is basically free game-wide. You just literally pay the points for units now. And simpler than that, because you've now got squad size locked for many different units, you either basically take a minimum sized unit or a maximum sized unit, and those are the only two sizes that you can fill with points. Games Workshop basically just keeping things locked to what's in each box set. So if you wanted to field a mid-sized squad, you technically can, but you still technically need to pay for a maximum size unit if you do so. Besides the main changes though, basically every single faction has had a whole load of things go up and down, perhaps not too surprising given that all the units have basically been looked at in Warhammer 40k. A fair few of them are kind of similar, but really quite a lot of them have gained some interesting abilities, or some big nerfs or buffs to their weapon stats, so maybe not too surprising that things have been shifted up or down a fair bit. Obviously it's going to take a massive amount of time to piece all these together, see what's good or bad for each faction, but I thought in this video we'll just take a look at a quick overview of every single army in the game, look at least 10 points cost for each faction, a fair few more for some of them, and just talk through what that means in context of the new units. This one's definitely not aimed to be a complete review of every single faction's points, but maybe just take a look broadly at some of the most important units in each army, and whether or not the points changes are particularly good or bad for them, as well as the free war gear and the squad size locking. Wasting no time, let's jump straight into it and start out with the Space Marines. Obviously Space Marines have more datasheets than most. If I get time tonight I might try and make a full video going through all of them, but here's just a few points costs to get a sample for now. Looks like your standard intercessors are 95 or 190. They'll bring the bolt rifle goodness. It does still seem that the tactical squad are paying less than them. I did suspect so given the locked datasheet and everything. They're only 175, and in that you'll get your heavy weapons and special weapons, so I think they still might kind of compete. The new big chunky Terminator squads are 205 or 410 for 10 of them. Certainly a bit of a cost bump there, but I think that was kind of expected given they went to toughness 5 and a 4+ invulnerable save. Definitely a fair bit tankier. Perhaps one of the most obvious ones that looks kind of concerning are the Desolation squads. Everyone's favourite new missile launcher on missile launcher Marines are 120 versus 240. I must admit a lot of people were kind of worried about the damage output of these guys already before we had the points. Being priced down at 120 seems very cheap to me. Pretty massive given that they have really quite dangerous missile launchers and a whole load of ignores line of sight firepower, and are a squad that you can get some buffs in. Hellblasters are also looking a lot better as well. 125 points or 250 for 5 or 10. I think they're looking very solid with their 2 shots out to 24 inches now and the new hazardous rule. Eradicators are a fair bit cheaper, down to 95 or 190. They've got their shorter range melter rifles and no double shoots but massive rerolls against vehicles. I feel like getting a bit cheaper is probably kind of appropriate for them. They're definitely a lot less kills everything. The new Ballistus Dreadnought seems to be 170 points, a decent amount cheaper than either the Redemptor and the Brutalis. I can see why though. While it does bring a fair bit of anti-tank firepower, its damage output isn't enormous, and the other two do hit hard in melee. I feel like the Redemptor looks a bit better than the Brutalis with that big -1 damage built in, which is rather nice. Blade Guard Veterans maybe haven't changed too much, 100 for 3 or 200 for 6. The Space Marine Whirlwind looks a lot more interesting now, retained a similar sort of price tag at 125 but massive increase in damage. Their Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 2 now, all rather good. The Gladiators seem okay, 145 for the Lancer with that really quite scary laser destroyer shot that hits very reliably. I feel like that's a good deal and probably beats out the Ballistas for raw anti-tank damage, and it's a bit more for the Reaper and the Valiant getting some nice extra damage against close range tanks. The Apothecary Biologist seems pretty nice to throw in a Gravis unit, 55 points to give them lethal hits, looks like that would work in Aggressors or Eradicators pretty nicely. And the man himself, Rabute Gilliman, is up to 355 points, not really too surprised that he's gained in points a bit, given that his combat stats and his defense got so much better, and also the double oath at the moment is huge. Definitely looks like some good stuff for the Space Marines in general. Hopefully I'll aim to cover them in a more complete video later. Next up we'll move on to the Imperial Guard and cycle back to some Divergent chapter Space Marines in a bit. Broadly speaking, for the Astra Militarum I kind of feel like Foot Guards seem kind of similar, Mech Guard seems to cost more, particularly Lehman Russ's got hit with some increases. Seems that Games Workshop decided to split up the Lehman Russ Battle Tank over 8 handy datasheets for your convenience. They vary from the cheapest for the Punisher and the Eradicator to the most expensive, the Demolisher. I can kind of see why that's the case given the fairly generalist and very threatening Demolisher cannon profile. Tank commanders are 240 points for the privilege of orders. Ross is already quite like the free war gear, I think. It means that you can take sponsons no questions asked, and you can even upgrade those to plasma or melter should you wish to, and you also get stobbers and hard killer missiles for no extra cost. Realistically, I feel like that makes up at least a decent bulk of the increase in points from the 150 to 165 that we had before. The Baneblade seems pretty pricey at 540 points, though does get the big toughness 13, so it's quite tough against some anti-tank weapons. Basilisk went down quite a lot at 110, and Manticores are 105. Their damage output's definitely worse than it was now, but that still seems very good for what they do, particularly as they hand out other debuffs. That's kind of nice. Leontis is cheaper, you get his big orders for 125. Cadian shock troops and the other infantry basically stayed kind of the same, 65 or 130. Deathcore Krieger looking really quite tanky for that price tag now, with their medics and things. Plus, these guys look absolutely intimidating to respawn with those reinforcement stratagems. Borgrin are 90 and 180, not enormously changed there. Kazakin squads have had a small points bump up to 120, I guess they scout about a bit now. And double orders is kind of fun as well. Tempestus Scions are 60 points or 120 points for a squad of 10. They seem like quite brutal damage output, particularly for flushing squads off objectives with the reroll hits. Chimeras are looking very trusty, being mobile command vehicles for 85, and Sentinels are 70 points for the armoured ones and 50 points for the scouts. Out of the two, I feel like the scouts are looking more efficient to me. Just seems way more value having the scout move, and I'm happy to take a small cut in durability. For the Sisters of Battle, the Battle Sister squad has locked 2 squads of 10 only now for 110 points. Fairly similar price tag, though they get their war gear built in now. Not bad to have a free multi-melter in the squad, and they will farm up the miracle dice, so I still think they're going to be well worth using. The Exorcist with its enormous ignores line of sight bombardment things is only 140. That one's looking rather good to me. Mortifiers you can only get 1 or 2 of in the squad now, and they're 60 or 120. Repentia, with their now reroll hits and wounds in combat, they're either 75 or 150, maybe not enormously changed in points cost there. They might be a little bit sad that they can't turn up from reserves and get within melter range now, though I guess it could be okay to drop them off with some rhinos. Celestian Sacrosants are 65 or 130. Morven Val has seen an absolutely spectacular points cut, down from around the upper 200s down to 135. Still seems decent enough in a unit of Paragon suits, but her big rerolls are just for the unit that she's leading now and can't be handed out to other squads on a whim. Speaking of which, the Paragon warsuits are still in units of 3 for 240. They're a bit easier to kill though, having lost the -1 damage, so that's probably part of the reason there, or at least they gained a 4+ invulnerable save. Finally, Celestine has come down in points a fair bit from 200 to 150. Seems reasonable enough to be honest, as she's lost a little bit of melee power. She's still going to be very annoying to remove from the table, though, miraculously returning from the dead. For the Custodes, these have perhaps some of the more complicated points values out of the indexes, just due to the Custodian Guard, the Terminators, and the Sisters of Silence, all having kits that you can build individual characters from. The Custodian Guard, it's basically 45 points per model. You can only take them in a minimum of 4 now, rather than a minimum of 3. And I feel like the way to go with them is Guardian Spears now, getting you some big rerolls if you're holding an objective. The Blade Champion's 100 points and can make a Custodian Guard unit go very fast indeed across the board. The Sisters of Silence Prosecutors are only 10 points each now. You can fill those in units of 4, so look like pretty excellent little distraction units, plus their objective control 2 for holding down points for cheap. They aren't really any good at messing with enemy psychic now, unless they actually directly get smited or something. The Witch Seekers are 12 for the scout move, which I think is reasonable, and the Vigilators are 12 as well. I certainly feel like a 48-point unit of Witch Seekers could be interesting for a tiny bit of mid-board threat. The Alois Terminators are 65 points each, really quite big that you can revive them from the dead with a 1 command point stratagem. I do find it super weird the unit sizes on these. Due to Games Workshop's rules, you can either fill these in 2s, 3s, 5s and 6s, but of course 4 is right out. Trajan Valoris is 145 points, a bit more of just a massive melee machine now as opposed to giving big buffs. The Shield Captain on foot is only 25 points less than him, but I feel like he's going to be really popular between his manipulation of the martial Qatar plus his free stratagems. The Terminator one's 120 and the Jetbike is 145. The Contemptor Dreadnought is a bit on the pricey side at 185 points. That's not great for the damage output, though resurrecting from the dead is quite nice. The Wardens are 150 or 300 each, with their extra durability for guarding characters. They're perhaps a little bit on the weird side, seeing as they're sold in boxes of 5. Kind of strange that they still have a very similar unit size to what they had before. The Land Raiders 260 points, and this one hits on 2s with the Custodes, which is quite nice. Feels like that's reasonable enough as attacks for just zooming some Custodes straight across the board. And the Virtus Praetor bikes are a bit on the expensive side, I think. 90 points, again fielded in the same way as the Terminators with weird squad numbers. They have just been toned down quite a lot across the board though, worse damage and defense, and the new fly keyword isn't as good with terrain. For the Admech, I feel like they're one of the armies that people have already latched on to that doesn't seem to have done very well out of these points changes. In particular, the Rangers are a lot more than people were expecting, over at 125 points. Their Vanguard counterparts are surprisingly cheaper at 100, maybe not too bad considering they've still got some auto wounds going on. Both of those are down to units of 10 now. Kind of weirdly, the Sindonian Dragoons and the Iron Strider Ballistari have kind of flipped in power. The Dragoons cost more now by quite a bit. I guess their melee is really quite general purpose, kind of fun that they get the anti-walker rule. And I guess the Iron Striders did lose a whole load of firepower as their main twin weapons got twin links rather than getting 2 shots, so they do have a lot less firepower going on. Core is 185 points, which I think is still very overcosted, particularly considering quite a lot of the faction leader characters went down. Another unit that's kind of flipped around is the Cataphron Breachers versus the Cataphron Destroyers. The Breachers cost more now at 150 or 300 for 3 or 6 of them. The Destroyers are 120 versus 240. I guess they fight a lot harder in combat. The Cataphrons with the heavy plasma culverins though still don't seem too bad for the cost, plus Overwatch on a 5+ could be pretty intimidating. Infiltrators, for some forward deployment, are 80 or 160, still look good for the midfield. Rust Stalkers are 75 or 150, maybe a tiny bit less of a general purpose threat now, but still really not too bad. I feel like the Strength 4 won't help them too much though, even if they can get devastating wounds. The Honor to Dune Crawler's gone up to 140 points. Not sure if it's really gained enough firepower to really justify that, to be honest. I suppose it's a bit tougher with a 2+ save though. The Scorpius Disintegrator seems to have gone up an awful lot though, all the way up to 195. Again, just seems to be perhaps a surprising amount for its firepower maybe. Grey Knights also again seem to be an army that's gone up a fair bit. I suppose they have gained quite a lot of utility though, with their teleport shenanigans, jumping on and off the board like crazy. Strike squads are 135 or 270 now. I guess still having at least reasonably quality melee and range comes at a bit of a premium in 10th, plus they do have their new save of a 2+, which I think will be helpful in a lower AP environment. The Dread Knight's gone up a fair bit to 215, though its guns and weapons still seem at least fairly threatening. That does feel fairly toned down from before though, and the Grandmaster version's 245. The Brotherhood Librarian is 110 points and still brings a fair few mortal wounds, Vortex of Doom throwing out 2d3 most of the time. Doesn't seem too bad for amping up the shooting of a Terminator unit teleporting around, but he perhaps won't be quite on the same level of deleting entire units as he was in 9th edition. Caldor Drago is a tiny bit cheaper at 155. He perhaps doesn't do quite as much for the army as he used to, no real damage buffs, but at least he gets a big charge out of Deep Strike on the turn that he comes in. I guess near guaranteed delivery for Terminators into combat really is quite scary, and he does add some melee threat, but perhaps a bit disappointing without the damage buffs. Otherwise, for the Grey Knight Battle line, Terminators are 225 or 450, Grey Knight's advantages plus the toughness 5, and Paladins go up to 255 or 510, really quite a massive chunky unit there still. Their defensive buff was shifted around to a -1 to wound if the enemy's attack is greater strength than their toughness. Interceptors I still think look pretty decent. They have had a points increase, so maybe aren't going to be carrying the battle damage of the army quite as much, but they've gained a move, shoot, move, and the 2+ armor save, both of which are kind of nice. Purifiers have their Purifying Flame attack under 150 or 300, a little bit more expensive than the strikes there. And Purgation squads are looking a bit more interesting with the teleport rules, being able to almost guarantee that they'll be able to see what they need to, and if they can't, they can fire out of line of sight as well. Seems they're the priciest of the Grey Knights in power armor though, up at 165 or 275. I guess the bigger squad size being a bit cheaper is probably deliberate, as you can get the 4 special weapons from the min-size squad, so adding extra bodies does give you less value than the initial ones do. They have done the same with the Space Marine Devastator squad, so I'd guess it's intentional. For the Imperial Knights, the armigers both got a bit cheaper. The Helverins are 145 and the Warglaves are 140. The Helverins are perhaps a little bit less general purpose with those autocannons at AP -1 I suppose, though can still get some nice buffs from the Questoris. And the Warglaves are pretty nice solid brawlers for holding the front of the battle line. Quite nice to have a thermal spear with strength 12 as well. A lot of Melter has strength 9. Otherwise, for the big boys, the Errant is 375 and the cheapest are the Questoris. Kind of surprised that the Questoris in general do seem to have come down a fair bit this edition, despite gaining toughness 12. I guess Games Workshop maybe feels that there's just lots of faction out there with some really quite decent anti-tank rules. I suppose lethal hits and single rerolls and things do seem to be going around quite a bit. Otherwise, the Paladin's 390 with that pretty scary battle cannon with rapid fire d6 plus 6, which is kind of obscene. The Gallant's 400 and still hits like a freight train in melee, and also is -1 to hit there now, which is kind of nice. The Warden's 420, perhaps partly just because the Avenger Gatling cannon went up to 18 shots, which is no small buff. Devastating wounds on top of that makes it just a really generalist weapon unless you're targeting monsters and vehicles, and -1 damage is one of the better bondsman abilities I think. The Crusader comes with 2 of the scary weapons and is 415, the Preceptor's 375, and Canis Rex is 405. I'm perhaps surprised to see him so cheap. He really does seem to be next level on quite a few of the knights in different ways. Free stratagems are pretty amazing when they're affecting an enormous knight, and exploding hits on a 5+ on everything is pretty massive as well. I feel like he's going to be kind of strong. The Dominus Knights also seem to have gone down a fair bit as well. The Castellan is 495. He gives the armigers nearby the benefit of cover as well, which is kind of cool. And the Volcano Lance remains kind of apocalyptic at damage d6 plus 8. I feel like the Valiant's going to be a lot of fun though, and people will be playing that again though. That Thundercoil Harpoon basically having a very good chance to just smash out 10 mortal wounds against enemy units is really fun. For the Imperial Agents, the Arbites Exaction Squad is 35 or 75. The Subdoctor and Vigilant Squads are significantly more expensive than that, 110 for the Subdoctors and 105 for the Vigilants. Inquisitorial Henchmen seem to have been reworked, really quite a lot more complex now. Various different flavours of Acolytes, Jokaro, Demon Hosts, and Gun Servitors and things, I guess to represent the new Henchman kits that Games Workshop came out with in Kill Team not so very long ago. Voidsmen could still be an interesting enough little screening unit for armies that don't have that many small units available, only 40 points for 5 of them. The Navy Breachers are 105, I'd still say very overcosted for those guys, and it does seem that the Assassins have all come down in points. Vindicares are only 80 points, which seems fairly nasty. If your opponent is running characters in units, then it seems like he could make his points back quite quickly if he can get a line of sight on a couple of choice targets. The base Inquisitor is 55, and in general the Inquisitors tend to vary around about 135 points or less, but higher than 55 for the rest of them as well. I feel like the Assassins are looking a lot more usable out of those ones. The Calidus does seem very frustrating, pinging on and off the board as well. Finally for the Imperium, let's talk through a few more Space Marines. Blood Angels got hit hard on their Sanguinary Guard, going up to 215 or 430 for a squad of those. That's a massive increase to be honest, and I don't really feel like they got much to compensate them for that. I certainly feel in 10th edition Blood Angels aren't going to be spamming them. Death Company with jump packs are either 155 or 310. Maybe not quite as bad a loss that one, given that you can still give them more Thunderhammers in that points cost, and I guess with 3 points it's generally going to be that or Power Fist, no reason not to. Otherwise, Dante's 135 seems interesting enough for Sanguinary Guard, making them +1 to hit. Having his favourite guards be a lot worse though I don't think is going to help him. The jump back Sanguinary Priest is 110 for the Feel No Pains. Lamartis I think looks pretty interesting for the Death Company with jump packs, and he is 135. The Death Company Dreadnought I thought had a really interesting stat line, but at 195 points that's a massive points bump. Probably not going to be quite enough to justify it. Maybe not the best on the Blood Angels side of things perhaps. For Dark Angels, their Primarch is 380. The line I think is going to be very intimidating at that sort of cost. Fights first on that kind of melee profile is very nasty. Looks like quite a disruptive model. Lazarus, with perhaps a slightly diminished role for Psychic, is cheaper at 80. He's quite easy to throw into a squad now. Deathwing Knights are 235 or 470. I feel like a lot of people might be tempted by the Command Squad now over that. They're a bit cheaper and they bring you the specialists within the unit, including Resurrection from the Apothecary. The Ravenwing Black Knights are still at least reasonably cheap at 115 or 230, a bit more expensive than they were though. The Scary Dark Talon with its Stasis Bomb is 210 points, still might be enough to justify it though between high volume Fire Hurricane Bolters with twin links, plus the Rift Cannon, and then the ability to have the chance of stopping a unit in its tracks once per game. Azrael seems absolutely great at 120 points, he could be going with some Hellblasters and he combos quite nicely with them, and the Ravenwing Talon Master has seen a fairly nice proportional points reduction. He's 115 points now. I think that kind of makes sense given that his damage output got cut down absolutely massively. Still looks like he could be kind of annoying at those points and not too bad to field. For the Black Templars, their Crusader squad is now just 160 points for 10 of them, which seems like that's in quite a good place there. They've got scouts and got some decent character buffs that they can access as well, so I feel like they seem rather good. Sword Brethren are interestingly almost the same cost as a Crusader squad, 150 or 330, maybe still a bit on the pricey side, though I do still quite like their special rule. The Emperor's Champion has dropped a fair bit, down to 85. He maybe doesn't really do all that massive things for the unit besides just adds extra damage though, but he does add quite a lot of extra damage at 6 attacks, strength 8 and damage 3. Maybe could be worth it to perhaps make a Crusader squad into a bit more of a threat against heavies perhaps. Helbrecht's a lot cheaper, down to 105 points. He makes his squads more likely to critical hit on a 5+, which is quite nice with some of the vows. Grimaldus is 120 and gives some big melee buffs as you'd expect. Quite nice that he can flex out his litanies as well. I think that that's really quite a nice touch and makes him very good for big squads. I feel like the Black Templars gladiator tanks and things are basically an extra 15 points and basically meaning that they just have to take that multi-melter to even justify coming along. Maybe not the worst cost for that extra gun, but it's a bit weird now that they've basically designed it so that if you've got a gladiator in Black Templars, if you don't take the multi-melter, then you're basically throwing away points. For the Space Wolves, a lot of their Index Wolves did seem kind of underwhelming, I thought. I feel like perhaps Blood Claws haven't done too badly out of the changes though. They're just 140 points for 10 of them, so they look like they're the singles cheapest Space Marines that you can spam. They do have a fairly decent bit of combat threat as well, just with a whole bunch of Astartes chainsaw attacks. You could put a surprisingly large amount of Fenrisian power armor on the board if you went heavy on them. The Hounds of Morkai with their devastating wounds are 95 or 190, a fair bit more pricey and absolutely lethal to Psychers. Wolfen got an absolutely massive power cut to their combat weapons. Everything is damage 1 now for some reason, which seemed very surprisingly low. At least again, they've come down in points massively for that, only being 20 points per model now, as opposed to being like 30 or 40. Still a bit sad that they're going to struggle to threaten really big hard targets now, when otherwise they would have just obliterated them with their claws and axes. Thunderwolves have also had a similar change, with getting a more generic relic weapon type profile like the Vanguard veterans. They're 100 or 200 for 3 or 6. Beyond the Fell-Handed I thought was quite an interesting character that could be interesting for getting some sagas off early, but at 220 points he does seem rather expensive. He's still got some cool stats and halves damage incident on him, but still that's an awful lot of points to be paying for his profile. The other character, Dreadnought Murderfang, is similarly very expensive as well. Probably a bit too much so, seeing that he's going to be able to be directly targeted by enemy ranged weapons now and can't hide, though he does still look thoroughly lethal if he manages to get into combat. Finally, for the more Divergent Space Marine chapters, we've got the Death Watch, fresh from having their Hellfire rounds and ridiculous mortal wound combo taken away for the sheer crazy amount of like 100 plus mortal wounds that you could potentially do in a turn. The Death Watch veteran squads can now load up on special gear for really quite a lot cheaper than before. They're basically just 20 points each, so frag cannons and things come cheaper than they were. That does look kind of fun for some close range heavy firepower. The Proteus kill teams cost a fair bit more. They go up to 165 or 330 points. I feel like they're going to be very weird, as they're basically just incentivized to take Terminators, I think. It just doesn't really work out that they could be balanced between, say, a Vanguard veteran and a Terminator. They do feel like a bit of an odd unit. Otherwise, for the Primaris teams, the Fortis one is 115 or 230, Spectrus is 110 or 220, and Indomitor is 135 or 270, with the chunky Gravis armor. Otherwise, for their unique characters, the Watchmaster is 115. He's got one of the rules to mess with opposing command points now, which is kind of nice. Maybe doesn't do a crazy amount for the actual squad itself though. And the Corvus Black Star Flyer is 180. For the Chaos Space Marines, Legionaries are 100 or 200 points now. They do get their gear rolled in, including things like Reaper chain cannons or las cannons in the squad if you want it. Cultists get 55 or 110 points for 10 or 20 of them, and they get their grenade launchers and things rolled in. Accursed Cultists are looking really quite a lot chunkier on their stats. They're either 95 or 190 points, going up a bit there, and I'm not really too surprised at that. Traitor Guard are 70 and Beastmen are 95. I feel like out of the two, the Traitor Guard are perhaps a bit more tempting. They do just seem to be generally quite decent objective holders with objective control too, and spamming a few plasma guns, but I feel like for grunt work, the cheaper cost of Cultists might still just outclass that. Chosen now really aren't all that much more than standard Legionaries. They come with the accursed weapons built in, and they get to fall back, advance and charge, so are a bit more mobile around the board. The Chaos Terminators are a bit cheaper than the Loyalist flavour, 195 or 390 points. They sort of seem like one of the better options for focusing stratagems and things on. Making them hard to see with the Nurgle mark seems kind of fun, and also you could have things like advance and charge going on with Slanesh and getting sustained hits in combat. The Hellbrutes are 155 points, which again I feel isn't amazingly great for their stat line, but for that Dark Ascension aura where they get the ability to choose 2 different Dark Packs at once, that's probably quite a good deal there. Seems pretty reasonable to have at least one of those in the centre of your force, and probably similar for the Demon Prince on foot as well. He's 180 points and gives you an aura of cover. A pair of those in the centre of your army seems pretty reasonable. They're going to help out quite a lot of units and have pretty scary stat lines just in themselves. The Winged Demon Prince, who's quite scary with one of the enhancements, can be 195. Abaddon the Despoiler is 280 for his general purpose all-round threat, farming command points, massive melee, and providing some interesting buffs to the squads with all those marks. The Obliterators are 160 for 2 of them, going up to 320 for 4. A little bit cheaper there, and their guns are still fairly general purpose. I feel like the Melter is quite nice. I do quite like their shoot out of line of sight power. The Lord Discordant I think is probably just a bit too expensive, given that he can be directly shot now. 220 points is a lot for him. And the Venom Crawler is 140. I guess that one's paying slightly for basically having the rate of fire of its guns doubled. Again, it gets a fun rule though for basically trying to finish off injured units and then getting more attacks throughout the game. For the Death Guard, people have been really quite down on the army's power ever since Games Workshop started previews. I'd say that probably on the points cost they haven't really done enough to really change things around for them, but they do have some interesting stats. In particular, their Blight Lord Terminators, despite having toughness 6, are some of the cheapest in the game, and that does seem good to me. I feel like Plague Marines are probably a little bit on the worst side overall, 100 or 200 points, for some reason without an option to have a 7-man unit, despite the fact that Games Workshop sells them as such. I guess could still be fairly punchy with a bunch of plague weapons, but I don't think that 1 point down is enough to compensate them for losing disgustingly resilient. The Death Shroud and the Blight Lords both don't seem too terrible for the cost that they are. The Death Shroud are 140 or 280 for 3 or 6. The Blight Lords have also dropped to 175 or 350. They do seem like Terminators that have just got a massive skew to defense, perhaps as they were before really. Not going to do a huge amount of damage to you, but will hopefully ground down the enemy over a couple of rounds of combat. Poxwalkers still seem like cheap and effective objective holders. Toughness 4 and a 5+ feel no pain seems fine enough for 6 points per model. I'd say they probably still beat out the Cultists, even if the Cultists are a tiny bit cheaper. For the Demon Engines, the Blight Haulers are 115 per model and you get 1 to 3. The Bloat Drone's 135 with that fun flesh mower. And the Plague Burst Crawler I think has maybe come out of this a bit worse, 175. Even with handing out Battle Shock and things with the Plague Burst Mortar, I still feel that that's probably got a lot worse than it was now. It is a fair bit easier to kill as well, at least relative to a lot of things in 40k. Mortarion has come down in cost significantly, 450 down to 370, perhaps not too surprising given the stat line change around maybe. I feel like that's maybe kind of in line with the abilities that is lost, and at least now he can hide behind terrain for a bit so he doesn't just get shot off the board turn 1. Chaos Spawn in general are 75 points for 2, I feel like that's a bit on the too expensive side really. They have got better but I don't think by quite that much. For leaders, a Lord of Contagion is 100 and Typhus is 115. Rerolling hits for 100 points doesn't seem too bad for the Lord of Contagion, particularly as he chips in pretty well with that great big Plague Blade of his. My initial impression would still be a bit on the overcosted side. Will be interesting to see how they actually shape up when we get to games though. For the Thousand Suns, the battle line of the Rubik Marines has dropped a little bit in cost, down to 95 points or 190. I felt like they've maybe not come too badly out of things with 3 Soul Reaper cannons thrown in, plus really quite a nice damage boost against enemies on objectives as well. Seems quite good that they could sit on their own objective and fire their Inferno bolts off against an enemy one. The Scarab Occult Terminators are up to 205 points or 410, a little bit more expensive there. Not really all that much though considering toughness 5. They also got decently tougher with their -1 to wound thing. Zangors are 65 or 130 now, so they've come down a little bit. I think like quite a lot of the cultist things for holding objectives, they'll be quite nice to farm your Cabal points, so perhaps 1 unit of those for home field objectives seems alright. The Enlightened on the discs are 45 or 90. For the most part, the Sorcerers are at least a little bit on the pricey side compared with a fair few characters from other factions. The Exalted Sorcerer's 90, the regular one's 85. Ahriman might not have the most exciting datasheet in the world, just throwing out an extra Kabbalistic ritual and giving you +1 to wound, but I feel like that's quite effective for 110 or 115. The Infernal Master can give you sustained hits 1 for 75 points, plus a little bit of dice manipulation with his Glimpse of Eternity. And the Terminator Sorcerer again feels like it's really quite good value for the Scarab Occult, 105 points to give them lethal hits as well as his own damage output, and even gives some potential army-wide reroll hit rolls of 1 against 1 marked targets. Otherwise the Mutalith is 145, Magnus is 410. I really think that that's not too bad considering his new profile. It's just massively dangerous both in terms of damage and defense, and doesn't seem to be too bad at getting around the board and can hide behind terrain now. The Demon Prince has perhaps had some similar changes to his other compatriots. In Thousand Suns he gives the stealth ability within 6 inches and also gives some precision shots. Could make Rubrics or Scarab Occult very good at sniping out characters. I guess particularly Scarab Occult with heavy weapons. The Demon Prince on foot is 210 and the Winged one is 190. For the World Eaters, their general trend has been points going up. Khorne Berserkers are a bit pricier at 115 or 230, though I guess that means that he gets the big melee weapon built in now. The 8-bound are really where the points have increased though, 155 or 310 for the regular 8-bound, which are very violent still and gain scout, and the Exalted ones are all the way up to 180 or 360, without perhaps having changed all that much there. I feel like these guys are certainly still destructive, but are now looking very fragile for the points cost. The Jackals are 75 or 150, I feel like they had one of the ones with the sticky objectives there. The Hellbrute's 150, and I feel like his rules were kind of fun. He's the one that gets to just retaliate every time that he's attacked, basically get a full shooting attack against the enemy if he gets shot, making him a very spooky unit to try and kill, and I feel like he might be one of the winners of the index. Angron is a lot more expensive at 415 points, after having maybe not changed all that much perhaps. Maybe Games Workshop is valuing the ability to respawn him, even if it's a little bit unlikely, needing 3 6s on your Blood Tithe roll. The Terminators and their new boosted profile are up to 195 or 390. The Khorne Lord of Skulls has lost durability, but is still really quite threatening. He's dropped a whole ton of points down to 420, perhaps a bit more tempting there. And Lord Invocatus is 155 points. He can still have a bunch of your units scouting alongside the regular 8-bound. For the Pantheon of Chaos Undivided, we have the Chaos Demons. For the troops choice, it now seems that Bloodletters have shifted to be the most expensive of them. I feel like that's definitely going to take the wind out of their sails a bit. Might be a little bit more competitive versus the other Khorne things, like the Blood Crushers perhaps. Plague Bearers are still looking chunky on objectives at 145, and Pink Horrors seem pretty great with the split rule for 140. I feel like just for sheer annoyance factor, they could still be one of the more popular troops. Demonettes are 140, and for the Greater Demons, they vary between 230 for the Lord of Change, all the way up to 330 for the Keeper. I feel like for that cost, the Lord of Change, with his really quite powerful psychic shooting attacks, has done rather well for himself. Bellicor's looking great at 325 for preventing your army from being shot until it gets closer. I'd say probably the Bloodthirster's looking a bit better than the Keeper of Secrets, at least from my first take. The Keeper definitely has its advantages, but just for the sheer breaks anything power, I feel like the Bloodthirster is better, particularly with 300 points versus 330. Otherwise, Skull Cannons still seem cheap and effective fire support, 115 for one of them with d6 plus 2 shots, strength 9 and damage 2. They hand out battle shock tests as well. The Burning Chariot's 135. The new version of Flames have dropped in points a bit, from 65 and 130. They've definitely lost a lot of potency from the last data sheet to this one. Plague Drones of Nurgle are 120 or 240, and the Fiends of Slaanesh are 150 or 300. For the Chaos Knights, the points costs are all shifted around a bit compared with the Imperials. I guess they'll likely make a bunch of changes based on their different datasheet abilities and how they stack up. Weirdly enough, the melee version, the Carnivore, seems to have gone from the cheapest to being the most expensive now. I guess it's all still very general purpose with that Slaughter Claw with a massive d6 plus 2 damage. There's very rarely anything that's going to stand in the way of that, and general purpose kills everything damage profiles are kind of rare in 10th edition. The Huntman's kind of the mirror of the Armiger at 140. The Stalker's kind of interesting in getting a big damage buff on enemy units that aren't near others. Really quite potent when you've got a big Demon Breath Spear with Melter 4. The Brigand's 150, and the Executioner Helverin-like one is 135. For the Big Knights, the Abominant is 395. Certainly not quite as all-around tough as he used to be, really. Losing the 5+ Feel No Pain perhaps wasn't the best for him. He's the one with the Warp Storms now that deal out mortal wounds within 9 inches of him. The Desecrator still seems good at 390, given the power of that enormous laser destroyer. The Despoiler, I must admit, seems kind of obscene. You can be dual-wielding those boosted Avenger Gatling cannons with 18 shots each. 36 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 out of this guy, all for just 410 points. He's going to be smashing down entire formations of Space Marines there. Even if his special rules aren't the most exciting, it still seems good. And the Rampager equivalent to the Gallant is 395. Again, like the Imperials, the Tyrants dropped really quite a lot. They're down to 485. Again, kind of an interesting mix of some enormous and scary damage profiles, and also giving nearby War Dogs cover. For the Aeldari, the Guardian Defenders are 110, and for some reason the Storm Guardians are 115. Really no idea what Games Workshop were thinking there. The Guardian Defenders just seem flat out better and help with your Fate dice, whereas the Storm Guardians just seem kind of terrible. The Avatar of Kane's gone up a little bit, but it's still looking very threatening, a general purpose melee monster there. The Striking Scorpions are 75 or 150. I think they're going to be pretty interesting as forward deploy units. Seem quite nice to hold the midfield and then hopefully chew out a whole bunch of mortal wounds against infantry that get too close. I thought perhaps one of the most interesting alterations was to the Dart Reapers though. They certainly lost a whole ton of power with those Reaper launchers, now damage 2 or damage 1 depending on the missile that you fire, but it also seems like they've come with a points cut that puts them in line with the other aspects more or less. They're only 15 points per model now. You can spam really quite a lot of them if you want to, and focus them for more focal damage buffs and things, as they're a big 10-man unit if you want them. Seems like if anything they could have actually improved a bit in efficiency, perhaps partially just because you're getting a lot more wounds for your points as well, which makes them a little bit less of a glass cannon than before. The Wave Serpent I think will still be very important for delivering shooty aspects to the front, that's 120. The Falcon's 140 with its deep strike shenanigans, and the Fire Prism's looking pretty terrifying with that linked fire prism cannon for 125. Potentially have all three of them link fire and blow up a whole bunch of units, and then move shoot move the other one so your opponent can't shoot any of them back. Given the Aeldari detachment rerolls, they do look kinda scary being that cheap. The D-cannon weapons that people were all quite excited about when they first appeared are 85 points each. Looks like you only get one of them per squad now, so there's no more 9 D-cannon lists. Still though, at 85 points for a D-cannon profile, that still seems incredibly powerful, particularly if you've got a Farseer nearby to throw D6 plus 2 mortal wounds on them. That's still going to be a fantastic area denial, and it's just going to delete a whole bunch of squads no questions asked. At that points cost, I still think they're very, very strong. Seems that Farseers are far cheaper though. They do bring some really quite good buffs to the units, but they're only 65 points and 75. I still think they're going to be an absolute auto-include within the army. Wraith Lords are 160 points, and the Wraith Knight actually seems somewhat good for the price now, down at 370. I feel like quite a lot of the Titanic units haven't done too badly out of these points changes perhaps. Harlequins do seem to be basically fully rolled into Aeldari these days. Inaria basically realised by having Evrain lead the army to soup in some Drukhari. The Harlequin troops are 15 points each, and you get them in squads of 5, 6, 11 or 12. Starweavers are 80, and Skyweaver jet bikes are 95 for 2 or 190 for 4. The Harlequin troops do seem to be at least fairly efficient combat troops for that kind of cost. A 4+ invulnerable save, you can give them a bunch of fusion pistols which are still very punchy, and their Harlequin special weapons get a +1 to wound on the charge as well, which is all very nice. Looks like they might be kind of hard to run as a full army these days though, given that they're not battle line. I feel like Games Workshop should have offered them a bit more support at launch really. For the Drukhari, I'm not sure the news is the best in the world for their foot troops. Cabalites and Witches are now locked to squads of 10 models only, and at least from first impressions for that kind of points cost, I don't really feel they're enormously exciting for their damage output. Racks also seem to be a bit more expensive, at 13 points per model now basically. Again, maybe not a unit to spam a whole load of. Otherwise, the transports seem to be a little bit cheaper for the most part. The Raiders are 90 and the Venoms are 80. I'd say perhaps one of the biggest surprises on these changes though is the change to the Ravager. It did lose a 5+ invulnerable save, but it does still pack some pretty equivalent firepower to what it had before. 3 shots with those Dart Lances are very punchy indeed, and it's even got better durability really, as it's toughness of 9, and it's not going to be killed by small arms anywhere near as much. For just 95 points, that just seems kind of mad good. Kind of hard to see why you wouldn't run 3 of those. Otherwise, Incubi are 85 points, maybe not enormously changed there. Drazar is 105, but has lost a little bit of melee threat. It's certainly not quite as much, just kill everything, no questions asked, though the +1 to wound for Incubi is still very nice. The Reavers are 75 for 3 or 150 for 6, a bit of a big points bump there, maybe not quite as much use for more fast moving utility. Telos are 90 points or 180 for 2. Hellions are basically 22 points per model, again maybe seem to be paying a bit of a premium for their speed there. The Archon's not too bad a generalist as well, allowing reroll wound rolls, or even better if empowered, you could actually make the damage output of Cabalites a fair bit more scary despite their increased points cost. For the Tyranids, and very much taking the spotlight in 10th edition, seems that Termagants have got a bit cheaper, down to 60 points base or 120 for 20 of them. Really quite nice to have a fair few of those scuttling about, particularly considering how easy you can replenish them. Otherwise the Hormagaunts still pay a bit of a premium for their quite fast moving speed, 70 points or 140. Gargoyles are 75 or 150 with their deep strike, and Eurogaunts, while they basically don't do much, I think are really quite interesting for cheap chaff. 45 points or 90 points, I think that's really not too bad for 11 or 22 models on the board. They're just a unit that can go up objectives with a whole load of objective control 1 points, and maybe even protect a greater Tyranid organism while doing so. They're just going to be very depressing to have to shoot. I feel like Von Rein's Leapers are in a pretty reasonable place as an infiltration fights first unit. 75 points for a squad of 3 of them seems very nice to have in the mid-board. They are somewhat dangerous to charge with their fights first. Interestingly, the melee warriors cost more than the ranged warriors by quite a bit. From an initial read of the datasheet, I kind of felt that they were sort of on a par. Surprised to see the one so much more expensive than the other. Biovores are either 40, 80 or 120 points. I'd be quite tempted to take a few small squads of one of them to throw out individual spore mines. That could be massively disruptive for the enemy trying to advance into the midfield. The Haruspex I think is standout, 125 points for really quite a big melee monster there, some massive stats, and compared with a fair few of the other Tyranid monsters of similar sort of points cost, that one just seems extra good. Kind of surprising that the Screamer Killer is so much more than it really. I feel like they're maybe not too massively different in terms of stats and abilities, but the Screamer Killer does seem to be a bit more on the expensive side. I feel like the Neurotyrant plus some Neurogaunts seems kind of interesting as a combined offering for 195 points. There's going to be a whole load of annoying objective control, some bugs to gum up the midfield a bit, plus a flamer attack, and of course the very spooky Shadow in the Warp that goes off at -1. For the Hive Tyrants, the Swarm Lord's 250, the regular Hive Tyrant 220, and the Winged one 195. I guess you can't really protect the Winged one quite so much anymore, maybe that's part of the reason for the drop. And the Hive Guards, to get them a little bit of protection, are 100 or 200, depending on whether you want 3 or 6. I feel like the Foot Hive Tyrant seems kind of nice at those costs. Run him up alongside some Hive Guards supporting the advance. The Genestealers are 90 or 180 to give you some scout move, early game threat. And finally, perhaps if anything, the Barb Gaunts seem to be even more overpowered than I might have guessed. These guys are 50 points or 100 points for a squad of 10 of them. They're the ones where you can divide fire like 5 or 10 different ways, and if your opponent's army's got a bunch of infantry, then it makes them -2 to move, advance, and charge. Just ridiculous amounts of debuffs there. The enemy army's not going to be going too fast anywhere with these guys around, and that's just ludicrous utility for this sort of cost. Barb Gaunts do seem absolutely auto-include. Next up, we've got the Genestealer Cults. These respawning horrors have perhaps paid a little bit of a premium for the ability to return to the board via their cult ambush. The Acolytes are 75 or 150, they've dropped down to some smaller squad sizes. The Neophytes kind of similarly a bit pricier, 80 or 160 for them. To do a bit of heavy lifting, the Aberrants are 165 or 330. The Jackals for a bit of scout moving are 80 or 160. But broadly speaking, a fair few of their support characters really aren't expensive at all these days. You could get the Kellamore, Reductus Saboteur, and Sanctus all on the board for less than 170 points, and that's quite a lot of disruptive threats that the opponent needs to think about at least a little bit. Otherwise, the Goliath Rock Grinder has gone up a fair bit. That one's up to 155. That one's maybe a little bit more expensive than I might have expected it to be, though I suppose it is quite a good general purpose threat with a decent amount of range and melee gear, plus can transport. The Goliath Truck is 110 for again a bit more dedicated transport there. The Patriarch is surprisingly cheap to be honest at 85 points. I know his stats got toned down a bit, but 85 points does seem basically auto-include just for a beat stick if nothing else. I feel like the dynamic of the army might be that the characters are a bit cheaper and the squads are a bit more expensive, depending on what can respawn and what can't. The Pure Strain Genestealers, with their Infiltrate ability, they're either 90 points or 180 depending on whether it's 5 or 10. They do have their 2 wounds now, so are a bit more durable, and they retains their very nice advance and charge, so you could still be having some fairly nasty alpha strikes between them and the Patriarch. They've got decent movement and can set up forward. At least on a first take, I feel like the Tau Empire really haven't done too badly out of these changes. Drones are basically war gear now, so if they ever cost points in a squad, they're now basically just rolled straight in, so you may as well take as many drones as you possibly can. And the same is true for other bits of kit and gizmo, things like the Fire Warrior's little turrets. The strike team are 100 points, so are a decent amount more than before. I guess perhaps that's partly to represent their drones and things being rolled in. They do seem quite nice for Overwatch as well, hitting on a 4+, really not too bad seeing as they get a couple of shots at strength 5. The Breaches are 115, so they're still paying a bit of a premium for their actually decently good close range damage. Crisis Suits are maybe kind of similar to how they were before. I feel like they'll probably work out to be a bit cheaper if you counted drones, though I guess they have diminished in value a bit. They'll also have their mentality shift a bit as well, given that they don't have any cost for doubling up on guns anymore, so you can spam away with things like plasma rifles should you want to. The broadside battle suits are 110 points each now in a squad of 1 to 3 models. Again, on first takes at least, they seem at least kind of efficient, might be one of the better firepower units of the Codex. The Riptide's 235, the Kroot Carnivores are 75 or 150, and the Hounds still seem pretty decent at 30 points for 4 of them. They are objective control zeros now, so they aren't particularly useful for taking objectives or anything, but still just having a scouting unit at 9 inches could really help screen out the enemy and keep any deep strikers and things away from your guns. The Ghost Kill's 170 points, the Hammerhead is 145, though I guess the Railgun doesn't just ping straight through invulnerable saves anymore. Piranhas are 55, and they get their Seeker missiles included for free now, so really quite a big Alpha Strike potential from them. And the various flavours of Commander are anywhere between 110 to 140, depending on type, and again they bring a fair bit of threat plus buffs of their own. The Ethereal costs 50 points now, and I feel like maybe he isn't the worst in a strike team maybe that's holding a home field objective. They farm command points each turn on a 4+, and give you a unit of 5+, feel no pain. For the Leagues of Votann, the majority of their army has come down fairly decently in points. I was kind of expecting that to happen, to be honest, given that previously they were released at sort of lowish points and then went up absolutely massively when Games Workshop realised just how much power they'd given them with the Judgment tokens. The new Judgment token system does seem a fair bit tamer than the old one, just a +1 to hit and wound, which is still great, but nowhere near the auto wounds and easy access to full rerolls that they had in 9th. The Hearthkin Warriors are still sort of similar for a base cost unit, 135, but with all their fancy gear rolled in now, you're actually getting quite a tooled up squad there. They can have their 3 flavours of scanner packs plus medic, fancy gear on the Thane, and something like a rail rifle to back up the anti-infantry shooting of the squad. Fairly solid troops, though you can only field them in 10s. The Hearthguard are perhaps looking like one of the more strong units in the Codex, 165 points for 5 of them, or 330 for 10. They've come down in points quite decently, get -1 to wound against enemy shooting, and have both strong melee and fairly strong shooting, just look all around quite efficient and dangerous. The Chthonian Berserks have come down a little bit to 135 or 270, definitely not quite as apocalyptically brutal as they were before though. The Thunderkin for 3 of them are 95, or for 6 are 190. The Hernkin Pioneer Bikes are 105 or 210. They still have Scout that's going to be useful, but maybe are just a little bit less essential to the army as a whole, given that they don't have objectives secured, and the Judgment tokens aren't just quite as much auto-kill things, even if they do amp up damage a bit. Their characters are all quite a lot cheaper. The Champion, Grimnir and Brock here are all 75, and the Carl is 90. Uthar the Destined is 115. Sagittars are still fairly pricey little transports at 120, and the Mighty Land Fortress, covered in guns, is 245. He's kind of interesting he's pretty brutal for boosting the firepower of a squad that gets out of one as well. Could have some nice synergy with moving some Hearthkin up to objectives, providing a bit of fire support, and then opening up with very dangerous guns both from the squad and the fortress itself. Moving on to the Necrons, I feel like they're looking at least fairly strong. Warriors have gone up in points a bit to either 120 or 240, which I think will feel bad if you're not buffing them with things, but with just the sheer amount of crazy reanimation you can get on these guys, you're probably going to want to invest in things like Technomancers and Resurrection Orbs. A Technomancer for a 5+ feel no pain and healing for just 60 points seems great, and 85 points for an Overlord for that Resurrection Orb plus free stratagems seems amazing as well. Otherwise, Flayed Ones can get you some Infiltrators now, 70 points for a fairly brutal anti-infantry threat on midfield objectives. Lichguard look like they're another very solid unit to buff, 95 points for 5 or 190 for 10 of them. They're looking surprisingly cheap for a very dangerous unit there, and again we'll absolutely love the buffs of some of these other units. Triarch Praetorians are a fair bit more at 135 or 270. The Monolith is a bit expensive at 385, that's gone up quite a bit, but it is still very useful I think. Should be nice for teleporting some squads to it. The Silent King has gone up a fair bit. He's 470 now, and is perhaps best for buffing a ranged Necron army. He brings a fair bit of shooting threat himself, and also allows you to reroll ones to hit and wound with the ranged units around. That's very nice. The Doomsday Ark does have genuinely good anti-tank firepower now, though still prefers to stay still. It's 185 points, so has gone up a bit there. The Necron Heavy Destroyers seem to be about the same at 45 points. Pretty massive when you've got some massive anti-tank damage 6 shots coming out of them. Still seems like they're going to be very efficient against their right targets and get built-in rerolls against either vehicles or infantry. Scorpec Destroyers have gone up a little bit, 110 or 220, maybe a little bit less support available for them, so might be a bit of a de-emphasis on those. And otherwise for supporting characters we've also got the Chronomancer for 50 points. That seems amazing for a -1 to hit and move shoot move, and the Plasmancer is actually genuinely dangerous for shooting Necrons now. Critical hits on a 5+ to activate your Gauss or your Tesla rule, plus his own damage himself. Broadly speaking, I feel like the Necrons have come out okay with these. They do look like an army that can create more layered synergies than several. Lastly, for the greenskins, we've got boys at 85 points or 170. Looks like they're paying for their boosted movement and 5+ save by a bit there. Beastnagger boys, again, are still significantly more, 105 or 210. That being the tax for their feel no pain and boosted strength. Mega Knobs are another one of those units that can be fielded anywhere between 2 and 6, but not 4. They're around about 33 points per model. They seem really quite fun with that mega armoured mech there, who can basically be an apothecary for them. He's 100 points, and he seems quite nice with a unit of 6 of them. The Knob Squad is a bit more expensive, 115 or 230. At least they get their fancy melee weapons baked in there, so you can have an entire squad of power claws for that. They look pretty great with something like a Pain Boy for 5+ feel no pain, and plus if they have a character in their squads, then they're -1 to wounds. Could be very nice with a war boss there. Storm Boys, I think, are maybe a bit on the pricey side. They're basically just boys that go faster, and while the extra threat range is great, they really are significantly more than just standard boys on foot now. Around about 13 points as opposed to 8.5. I feel like that might be a bit much. Commandos are kind of similar in price. They do get a bunch of fancy upgrades baked into the squad though, like that distraction grot, and some fun range and melee weapons, so maybe the price of those doesn't seem quite as bad by comparison perhaps. Gretchen I think are going to be auto-include for at least a few units of those, 45 points for Objective Control 2 models and 11 of them. They're very easy to kill, they won't do much to your opponent, but they will win games just by being on objectives and even farm your command points while doing so. At least some of those seems basically auto-include, though I wouldn't go too many. Mech guns look like they remain some very good dedicated fire support for their cost. All the guns cost the same now, so I guess it's probably back to just taking custom mega cannons all the time. They're 45 points each. Warbikers are 75 points or 150, still seems okay for what they do I suppose. Ghazghkull Thrackers come down in points a bit, down to 235. Not really too surprising now he's not really a direct damage dealing monster, more a leader for Mega Knobs. That cost also has Makari baked into it as well, so that's quite nice. He'll give the boss an extra layer of durability with his 2+ invulnerable save until he fails one. Ghazghkull's lethal hits aura in the War is pretty big as well. That combines kind of brutally with one of the Orky stratagems to get critical hits on a 5+. The Death Tread has unfortunately paid for its new better profile with its 2+ save and toughness 9, movement 8. Still probably looks kind of mediocre at that kind of cost. The Killer Cans are 150 or 300 for either 3 or 6. Finally, and I guess maybe ending on a slightly negative note, the Stompers up to 800 again. Still basically unplayable in any sort of competitive list, I'd guess. I think in general it probably is just being kept kind of deliberately a little bit on the niche side, so every Orky list doesn't just turn into a Stomper plus a few extras. Would be a bit nice to have it a little bit closer to playability though. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a bit of a tour through the new Warhammer 40k 10th edition points costs. Let me know your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Which units do you think are looking good or bad for your army? And are there any particularly standout units that are either far more expensive or far cheaper than you might have guessed? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'll hopefully be back later in the day to talk about the Space Marine points costs individually, try and do a full faction review of them, and after that I'll aim to try and get a similar one done for Tyranids as well, depending on time. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Making all the content does take an enormous amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.